Hey guys, tonight we're tracing the life of a man who changed the world without ever wielding a sword, writing a law, or founding a city, though he dreamed of all three. You're about to walk the winding path of Plato, the philosopher who never stopped trying to explain his teacher to a world that wasn't ready to listen. You stand in a city still cracked from war. Athens, once proud and shining, now limps along with bruises on its soul. It's not just the walls that have crumbled, it's trust, tradition, even the gods themselves. You smell burnt oil, hear children bickering over olive bread, and step over a discarded helmet half buried in the dust. Somewhere, a drunk is shouting about Sparta again. You're not a soldier. You're a child, quiet, curious, watching. In a stately home nearby, a boy named Aristocles grows under the stern gaze of ancestors and expectations. You'll know him as Plato, eventually, but not yet. Right now, he's just a kid with polished sandals and questions no one wants to answer. His family has money, status, and the occasional scandal. Think of them as Athens' version of political royalty with a touch of philosophical guilt. His relatives include kings, generals, and poets. His uncle, Charmides, flirts with tyrants. His stepfather, Pyrilampes, throws lavish symposia full of men who sip wine and pretend they understand virtue. And his older brothers? Let's just say they're more into wrestling and war than wisdom and dialogue. But young Plato, he listens. Not just to words, but silences. He watches how people argue, how they flinch when confronted, how they worship statues and ignore starving beggars. He feels the pulse of a city losing faith in its gods and itself. You're with him now as he walks the agora, watching philosophers shout and merchants cheat. You notice how the city is trying to be something it can't remember how to be: noble, free, enlightened. The Peloponnesian War has ended, but the scars haven't. Sparta may have won, but Athens is still dragging its pride behind it like a broken sandal. And in the middle of all this confusion, Plato grows. He learns to wrestle, to memorize Homer, to trace geometry in the sand with a stick. His body moves through the world of heroes and myths. But his mind, it's elsewhere. Something in him aches for meaning that doesn't come wrapped in a story about Zeus throwing thunderbolts. Historians still argue whether Plato's early life was shaped more by trauma or tradition. Some say he was destined to be a statesman. Others say his brush with political disaster turned him toward the stars. What's clear is that Athens' fall shattered something in him. Maybe hope. Maybe certainty. And yet, he doesn't despair. Not yet. Instead, he waits, for a voice unlike any other. One that doesn't just speak answers but demolishes the question entirely. You'll meet that voice soon. But first, one quirky fact: young Plato was supposedly nicknamed for his broad shoulders. Platon means broad in Greek. Yes, before he was a brainy philosopher, the guy had gym bro credentials. Still, even with that muscle, he never quite fit in with the power-hungry elite. He didn't want to conquer. He wanted to understand. And in a city full of speeches, he wanted a conversation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this from somewhere far away, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see who's drifting off around the world tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because here, just beyond the flickering torchlight of a crumbling Athens, is where the search for truth begins. You wake up early, long before the sun warms the marble columns. The city's still asleep, save for the groan of cartwheels and the soft mumble of vendors setting up shop. You sneak past your stepfather's quiet courtyard and out into the maze of Athens. You're not running away, but you are searching. For what? You're not sure. but it feels bigger than you. Your name is still Aristocles. And you're starting to realize your family name opens doors, but it also traps you inside them. You're born into the aristocracy, after all. That means you get the best tutors, the richest food, and invitations to the best symposia, those wine-fueled debates where men pretend to chase truth but mostly chase status and servants. You try to care. You really do. You memorize Homer's epics. You practice the lyre. You wrestle at the gymnasium. Your teachers say you're brilliant. But something's missing. Something sharp. Something strange. And then one day, you feel it, the split. It starts during a family dinner. A visiting politician is boasting about the need for harsh justice, how exiling traitors is a noble act. But you remember watching one of those traitors, a friend of your uncle, be dragged from his home with his children crying behind him. You ask a question, what makes justice different from revenge? The room goes quiet. Someone coughs. Your mother gives you that look. It's the first time you learn, not all questions are welcome, even in a city that prides itself on freedom. Your relatives expect you to go into politics. To lead. To carry the family name. But you feel more like a spy in your own home, studying how people lie to themselves and call it honor. You start writing poetry, epics, even. You dream of becoming a tragedian. Yes, Plato, the moody teenage poet. It was a phase. Historians still argue whether Plato ever intended to rule Athens or just flirted with the idea before burning the blueprints. But he clearly saw politics as both necessary and toxic, like medicine made from poison. Here's your quirky bit for tonight. Some ancient sources claim that Plato's father, Ariston, was a direct descendant of the god Poseidon. Which means, if you believe the paperwork, Plato may have had sea god blood. Poseidon, king of waves and earthquakes. Fitting, since Plato would go on to shake the intellectual world like few ever had. As you grow older, you begin to glimpse the rot under the marble. You see how democracy can become mob rule. How rhetoric can twist truth into performance. And how charm can outvote wisdom. You walk the Knicks where assemblies meet, watching men shout over each other like children pretending to be kings. You begin to suspect that the wisest voices are often the ones least heard. And then you hear a whisper about a strange man. A man who doesn't lecture, but questions. A man who doesn't teach, but irritates. A man who says he knows nothing, and makes everyone else prove it. His name? Socrates. You haven't met him yet, but his name follows you like the scent of something burning, unpleasant, but impossible to ignore. Still, you're not ready. Not yet. You're still tangled in your own ambitions. You flirt with tragedy, with drama, with the idea of being adored. You write plays that no one remembers. You try to fit into the mold they've built for you. But it breaks, every time. One day, you watch a man offer a public prayer to Athena, then turn and cheat his neighbor in a trade deal seconds later. And something inside you snaps. You don't want to play this game anymore. You don't want to rule this city. You want to understand it. And then, just when your own questions start bubbling up too fast to silence, you finally cross paths with the barefoot men who will ruin and rebuild your entire world. But we'll get to that next. For now, you lie awake at night, the Athenian moonlight carving silver shapes across your room, wondering if you're the only one who feels like the city's foundations are built on sand. Spoiler, you're not. The first time you hear Socrates speak, it's not what he says that changes you, it's what he doesn't say. You're at a gathering, one of those crowded symposia where the wine flows faster than the truth. Somewhere between a poem about Eros and a smug rant about military glory, a wiry man with sun-dried skin and a lopsided face interrupts. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't flatter. He asks a question. Then another. And suddenly, the proudest man in the room looks like he forgot how to count. You laugh, quietly at first. Then louder, until you realize no one else is laughing. They're embarrassed. Offended. Even afraid. But you're captivated. This is your first glimpse of Socrates, barefoot, disheveled, standing in a room full of polished lies and holding up a mirror with no silver. He doesn't argue like the others. He just asks, "What is justice? What is courage? Are you sure?" And then he waits. With eyes that don't blink and a silence that stretches longer than most men's patience. You approach him afterward, expecting to feel wise by osmosis. Instead, he tells you he knows nothing. That you probably don't either. And for some reason, this doesn't insult you, it frees you. You start following him. At first it's curiosity. Then it becomes a habit. Then a hunger. You walk through Athens with him, watching him pester generals, merchants, priests, poets. No one is spared. Not even himself. He tears apart definitions with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of a stand-up comic. And you're hooked. Historians still argue whether Plato became Socrates' student formally or just orbitally. There's no syllabus, no sign-up form. Just daily brain combustion with the most annoying genius in Greece. You abandon your poetry. You stop pretending to care about politics. You even stop going to dinner parties, unless Socrates is there, of course. Your friends roll their eyes. Your family worries you're wasting your potential. But you're starting to suspect that what they call potential is just a fancy name for conformity. One day, you watch Socrates debate a wealthy man who claims to be good. Socrates dismantles him gently, like peeling an onion, layer after layer, until the man realizes he's got more money than morals. When it's over, you don't cheer. You just sit there, staring into the space where that man's certainty used to be. Here's your quirky detail for the night. Socrates was known for standing still for hours, sometimes even a full day, deep in thought, unmoving like a statue. People would literally gather just to watch him not move. Imagine someone doing that on TikTok. But back in real time, you're realizing something strange. The more time you spend with Socrates, the more confused you feel, but in a good way. It's like your brain is stretching, aching, waking up from some long, inherited dream. He talks about the soul like it's a muscle. About virtue like it's a craft. About knowledge like it's water, slippery, but necessary. And you start to see the city differently. That merchant. He's terrified of dying poor. That soldier. He's desperate for someone to call him brave. That priest. He probably doesn't believe half of what he's preaching. And you don't want applause anymore. You want understanding. You want truth. Even if it ruins you. Socrates doesn't teach you facts, he teaches you how to endure the absence of them. And in doing so, he becomes something more than a mentor. He becomes the center of your intellectual universe. You don't know it yet, but you will spend the rest of your life trying to bring him back, word by word, question by question. For now, you're just a young man following an old man around the marketplace, annoying everyone within earshot. And you've never felt more alive. You're waking earlier now, not to escape your family, but to catch up with Socrates before he starts dismantling someone's worldview by the fish stalls. You trail him through the agora, still sleepy-eyed, clutching a fig you don't remember buying. The streets are coming alive, potters setting out jars, bakers yelling over ovens, the faint stench of yesterday's fish still clinging to the cobblestones. Socrates is already mid-interrogation. His target. a local sculptor who claims to understand beauty. Within minutes, Socrates has him tripping over his own definitions like loose tunics. So, if beauty is symmetry, are snakes beautiful? The man stammers, rephrases, and then walks away, muttering something about wasting time. You're used to this now. Watching Socrates strip language down to its bones, asking questions so basic they make people angry. You start to wonder, why does the truth irritate people more than a lie? At home, things are tense. Your family hoped you'd step into politics by now. Maybe court a noblewoman. Build influence. Instead, you're loitering around a barefoot gadfly who talks more about the soul than the city. They say Socrates is corrupting the youth. You suppose they mean you. And yet, you've never felt clearer, sharper. Even when Socrates turns his questions on you, which he does often, with a smile. Do you know what courage is, Plato? You think you do. You speak confidently. Socrates blinks. Then he asks you to define every word you just used. By the end of it, you're not sure if you know anything, but somehow, you feel closer to truth than ever before. You start writing notes. Not formal essays, just scraps, observations, half-formed arguments, phrases Socrates repeats often. You're building a map of the invisible terrain he walks through every day. A path made of logic, intuition, and quiet rebellion. Historians still argue whether these early notes became the seeds of your dialogues or were lost entirely. Some suggest you memorized entire conversations. Others think you filled in the gaps with imagination later. The line between memory and myth is blurry, but you don't care. What matters is that you remember. And then there's the embarrassment. Yes, Socrates embarrasses you sometimes. He walks barefoot in the winter. He mocks respected generals. He makes crude analogies about donkeys and midwives when discussing the soul. But somehow, none of it feels wrong. He's not playing the fool, he's exposing that the emperor has no toga. Here's a quirky tidbit. Socrates claimed to be guided by a daimonion, a kind of inner voice or spiritual sign that told him what not to do, but never what to do. Think of it as a divine gut instinct with a really judgmental tone. He once turned down a public office because his daimonion disapproved. Even his intuition had boundaries. Your own instincts. They're growing sharper. You start seeing patterns, how fear shapes action, how ego masks ignorance. You listen more. Not just to Socrates, but to the silences between other people's words. Sometimes Socrates talks about death. He doesn't fear it. He calls it either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another world where better minds await. You're not sure which idea scares you more. Still, you begin to think, maybe philosophy isn't just about truth, it's about preparing to die well. And that's not something you can explain to your cousins at dinner. So you drift further. Away from wealth, ambition, and inheritance. Closer to questions no one else wants to ask. You're not a disciple. Socrates doesn't do disciples. You're a fellow traveler, tired, confused, but deeply awake. You don't know it yet, but you're forming an idea. A vision. Of a world where men like Socrates don't die in courts, they lead them. A city ruled by philosophy, not pride. But that world is far away. For now, you just walk beside a man who claims to know nothing, and somehow makes everyone else seem hollow for thinking they do. And you love him for it. You hear the news on a windless day, the kind of day where even the birds seem unsure whether to sing. Socrates is being charged. Corrupting the youth. Disrespecting the gods. Teaching dangerous ideas that twist noble minds into doubt-filled skeptics. You blink. Then laugh, because surely, this is a joke. But it isn't. You attend the trial, your stomach a fist. You watch the crowd gather like moths around a flame they don't understand. The man who's been the moral compass of your life is now the city's scapegoat. Athens wants its balance back, and apparently, balance means silencing the man who's been holding up a mirror. You sit among the crowd, friends, former students, enemies. Everyone's here. Socrates stands calmly, barefoot as always, like he's attending his own birthday rather than a trial that could end in death. And then he speaks. No grand theatrics. No pleading. Just that same quiet blade of logic. He defends himself not with excuses, but with truth. I am a gadfly, he says. Annoying, yes, but necessary. He reminds Athens that comfort without examination is rot. That the soul is more important than survival. And you feel it, the room shifting. The jurors shifting. Not toward sympathy, but discomfort. They don't want truth. They want quiet. Socrates isn't executed by malice. He's executed by unease. Historians still argue whether his sentence, death by hemlock, was truly unanimous, or just the product of a tense, prideful majority. But you don't care about the vote count. You care about watching a city commit intellectual suicide. You visit him in prison. He jokes. He comforts you. You try to be brave, but your voice shakes. He tells you not to mourn. Death is either a peaceful sleep or a great migration of souls. Either way, he's ready. Here's a chilling detail. Socrates was offered a chance to escape. Friends had a plan. Bribes were in place. But he refused. If I run now, he said, I contradict everything I've ever taught. He drank the poison not just with dignity, but with consistency. You hold his hand as his body begins to fade. He speaks slowly, evenly, guiding you through the process like he's explaining how to clean a wound. You notice how everyone else is weeping, but Socrates is the calmest man in the room. And then, he's gone. The silence afterward is unbearable. You walk home through the city he loved, a city that didn't love him back. You pass the stoa where he used to argue, the market where he used to question, the well where he once compared ignorance to thirst. And you feel hollow. But that hollowness doesn't stay empty. It starts to fill. Not with rage. Not with revenge. But with words. You start writing. First from memory, then from grief. Dialogues. Scenes. Conversations that never quite happened the way you write them, but should have. You realize you can't bring Socrates back. But maybe, if you write him carefully enough, if you ask the questions he asked, someone else will hear him. You don't sleep for days. You don't eat much either. You sit by candlelight with wax-stained fingers, scratching out a voice that won't go away. People around you start to move on. Talk about new scandals. New heroes. But you're stuck in that prison room, replaying his last words over and over like a melody that refuses to fade. You lost a friend. A teacher. Maybe even a father figure. But you also gained a mission. You no longer want to be a ruler. You want to be a mirror. And this time, you'll be the one holding it up. You leave Athens. Not with drama, there's no speech, no torchlit farewell. Just a quiet exit, like slipping out of a house that no longer feels like home. You pack a small satchel, a few scrolls, and the weight of a man-shaped absence. You tell no one your destination at first. Maybe because you don't know. You just walk, as if putting distance between your sandals and Socrates' grave will somehow keep the ache from cracking open your chest. You wander through Egypt, where priests whisper about divine geometry and souls that travel through stargates. You marvel at temples older than your city's myths. You learn about sacred numbers, breath control, and a strange belief that the soul is weighed after death. In Italy, you visit the Pythagoreans. They wear white robes and live like philosophical monks. They teach that the universe hums with mathematical harmony, that everything, even the soul, vibrates with purpose. You respect their devotion. But still, you miss Socrates' smirk, his messiness, his refusal to give easy answers. Everywhere you go, people claim certainty. They have systems, gods, rituals, numbers, names. And all of it, feels too solid, too smug. You want something more slippery. Something more honest. You begin writing again. Not just memory, this time, structure. You start shaping your dialogues into philosophical dramas, complete with characters, questions, and long winding conversations that twist like ivy around the soul. Historians still argue whether your travels were real or allegorical. Some claim your Egyptian detour was more inspiration than itinerary. Others think you soaked up more mysticism than you let on. What's clear is that something changed. The poet in you went quiet. The architect woke up. You start to dream of a city, not a real one, but a possible one. A republic where justice isn't bought and sold. Where philosopher kings govern because they must, not because they want to. Where the soul is trained like a muscle, and power is earned through wisdom, not birth. It's a beautiful dream. A dangerous one, too. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. Legend says that during your travels, you were briefly captured and sold as a slave. Yes, Plato, enslaved. Bought by a wealthy admirer who, upon realizing who you were, promptly paid your ransom and set you free. Whether it's true or just poetic symmetry, it's a story that fits, the philosopher who had to be owned to understand freedom. You begin shaping Socrates into something more than a memory. In your dialogues, he becomes the ideal questioner, the immortal gadfly. The real man may be gone, but in your words, he sharpens, becomes something timeless. You no longer walk beside him. But in your writing, you sit across from him every day. And in the quiet hours, you wonder, did you ever truly know him? Or just the version of him that lived in your own longing? Either way, you vow not to waste what he gave you. Athens may have sentenced Socrates to death, but you're going to make sure the world never forgets him. You return home eventually. Not with fireworks or fanfare. Just scrolls under your arm and a new fire in your chest. You left as a grieving student. You return as a man with a mission. You're back in Athens, but the city doesn't recognize you anymore. Or maybe, you don't recognize it. The same streets. The same crooked stoas. The same pigeons fighting over sesame seeds. But everything feels smaller now. Less divine. Less certain. You walk past the court where Socrates was condemned, and it's just stone and dust, but to you, it might as well be the site of a crucifixion. You find your corner of the world. A quiet grove outside the city walls, shaded by olive trees, where you begin to construct something new, not in marble, but in mind. You call it the academy. Not a school, not exactly. More like a sanctuary for people who still believe questions matter. It's the first of its kind in the Western world, a university before anyone thought to use that word. Your students trickle in, idealists, cynics, misfits, geniuses. Some stay for a day. Others for life. You teach them geometry and music, ethics and metaphysics. But mostly, you teach them how to sit with uncertainty, and not flinch. You write and revise obsessively. Not dry treatises, but dialogues, theater of the intellect. You put words in Socrates' mouth again, reanimating him like a philosophical ghost. Except now, he's doing more than irritating merchants, he's designing entire cities. The Republic becomes your masterpiece. A blueprint for a society governed not by wealth or war, but wisdom. In this city, the just rule, the brave guard, and the common men, well, he learns how to shut up and take philosophy seriously. It's radical, audacious, maybe even impossible. But that's not the point. The point is to show that justice can be imagined. That society isn't doomed to ignorance. Historians still debate whether you actually wanted this republic built, or whether it was just an intellectual exercise, a what if. But deep down, you knew, ideas shape people, and people shape cities. So yes, you meant it. Here's a strange little fact. In your ideal city, you propose banning poets. Yes, you, once an aspiring tragedian, argue that poets are too emotional, too misleading, too dangerous. They lie beautifully, you say. And that's exactly the problem. The irony isn't lost on you. You've become the thing you once feared, a system builder, a rule maker. You hate it. And yet, you believe in it. You want a world where no one has to drink hemlock for telling the truth. And so you write. You invent the concept of philosopher kings, those rare souls who hate power enough to wield it wisely. You classify the human soul into three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. You even start sketching how education should function, from arithmetic to dialectic, from gymnastics to astronomy. You're not building a city of marble. You're building one of mind. And quietly, beneath all of this, you're still speaking to Socrates. Still trying to finish conversations that death interrupted. Still trying to make his voice louder than the silence that followed. Your students start quoting you. Not Socrates. You. It feels wrong. But also, inevitable. You are no longer just the confused young man trailing a barefoot philosopher. You are becoming a philosopher in your own right. And yet, you never quite leave the shadow of that trial, that prison, that cup. Because everything you write, everything you teach, is just another way of saying, he shouldn't have died. You try to bring philosophy into the real world. You think, maybe if rulers were wiser, cities wouldn't murder their thinkers. Maybe justice could be more than an idea in a scroll. Maybe, just maybe, you can mold the world to match your republic. So you leave Athens again, this time not to mourn, but to intervene. You travel to Syracuse, a city shimmering with marble palaces and the scent of sea salt and ambition. Its ruler, Dionysius, is young and powerful, and rumored to be open to new ideas. You've been invited by his uncle, Dion, a student of yours, who believes you can turn the boy into a philosopher king. You believe it too, for about a week. Then you meet Dionysius. He's charming, curious, dangerous. A man who loves being flattered and hates being wrong. You start with light teachings, ethics, justice, the soul. He nods politely. Then he gets bored. He wants praise, not puzzles. You begin to feel the old nausea. The Socratic nausea. The creeping realization that most men don't want to be wise, they want to appear wise while remaining comfortable. You try anyway. You tell him truth isn't power, but its antidote. That ruling justly requires discipline, not desire. He smiles and offers you better wine. You try to explain the nature of the soul. He asks if the people will still pay taxes. Historians still argue whether you truly believed you could train a tyrant, or whether you just hoped, desperately, that someone with power might finally listen. Either way, it ends badly. You're accused of political meddling. Of trying to replace Dionysius with Dion. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter. You're exiled. Maybe even nearly executed, sources differ, and you're suspiciously quiet about the details. Eventually, friends pay your ransom again, and you return to Athens. You arrive exhausted. Disillusioned. You tried to translate philosophy into governance, and it broke in transit. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. During your time in Syracuse, you reportedly wrote letters begging Dionysius to embrace virtue. Some of these letters survive, but scholars argue whether you wrote them or they were forged by admirers later on. Either way, they read like love letters to an idea that refused to love you back. Back home, you shut the door on politics. No more tyrants. No more kings. Just the mind. You return to the academy with a deeper resolve. You realize that philosophy isn't meant to serve politics, it's meant to warn it. You start speaking of rulers not as saviors, but as symptoms. If a city is sick, it doesn't need a philosopher king, it needs better questions. Your students grow. So does your skepticism. You keep teaching, keep writing, keep refining your ideas. But part of you stays in that Syracusan palace, watching power grin in the face of wisdom. And in quiet moments, you wonder, was Socrates lucky to die before he saw how little the world wants to change? Still, you write. Because even if your ideal city crumbles under reality, maybe your words can build something stronger. Maybe not a city. Maybe a mind. You return to your olive grove with dust on your sandals and disillusion thick in your lungs. You tried. You really did. But the world wasn't ready for a philosopher king, and maybe it never will be. So now, you focus on what you can build. Not politics. Not power. A school. You expand the academy. At first, it's a few benches in the shade and a scroll or two passed around. But slowly, it becomes a community, then a movement. There's no uniform. No bells. No tuition. Just minds in motion, guided by the idea that learning is not about collecting facts, it's about awakening the soul. You walk the paths daily, robes swaying, gesturing with a stick as you draw triangles in the dirt. Your students follow you like shadows. Some become skeptics, others mystics. Some challenge you openly. You let them. Socrates would have. You organize your curriculum around what you call the four subjects: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Why? Because these disciplines force the soul to look upward, away from the material and toward the eternal. Toward what you call forms, those invisible, perfect realities that everything in this world only imitates. The academy begins to attract brilliant minds. Mathematicians, astronomers, idealists, and even critics. People come from as far as Asia Minor and Libya just to sit on the ground and hear you unravel the structure of the cosmos. One day, a gangly teenager with a mop of hair and too many questions shows up. His name is Aristotle. You don't know it yet, but he'll become the brightest, and most difficult, student you'll ever have. He's sharp. Restless. Slightly arrogant. You like him immediately and also want to throw him in a well. Historians still debate how close the two of you really were. Some say he was your intellectual heir. Others argue you two argued constantly. The truth? Probably both. You respected his mind, but his obsession with biology and observation clashed with your love of abstract perfection. You dreamed in geometry. He dreamed in categories. Still, you both believed in reason. Here's a delightful fringe fact. The academy reportedly had an inscription at the entrance that read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Which sounds snobbish, until you realize it's less about math and more about mindset. Geometry demands discipline, order, and a kind of sacred patience. Qualities you value more than charm or chatter. You keep writing, too. Dozens of dialogues now. Some are playful, others profound. You invent characters, scenes, entire imaginary conversations where Socrates continues to live, not just as a memory, but as a method. And you notice something. Your Socrates is changing. He's becoming more idealized, more constructed. Less like the men you followed through the market and more like the symbol you now use to teach your deepest convictions. You pause one night while editing a dialogue. Candle burning low. The air thick with summer dust. You ask yourself, have I preserved Socrates? Or have I remade him into what I needed him to be? You don't answer. You just keep writing. Because maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe philosophy isn't about remembering perfectly, but about remembering meaningfully. And in this little grove outside a city that once killed your teacher, you've planted something that might just outlast every empire. A place where minds can stretch. A place where truth still matters. A place where Socrates, your Socrates, can still speak. You write as if haunted. And in a way, you are. Socrates has become your ghost, your muse, your compass. But also, your invention. The dialogues flow endlessly now. Phaedrus, Parmenides, Gorgias, Meno. Each one a crafted debate, a philosophical play performed by shadows of people you once knew. Some of it is memory. Some of it is fiction. You never clarify which. You sit alone in the academy courtyard, a wax tablet balanced on your knee, as you script another conversation between Socrates and someone who never quite existed. You give your teacher sharper words than he ever spoke in life. Wiser insights. Cleaner logic. Your pen chisels him into marble while your memory quietly fades. And yet, somehow, it feels true. You know what you're doing. You're not lying. You're preserving. Socrates didn't leave scrolls, he left echoes. It's your job to catch them before they vanish. Historians still argue which dialogues reflect the real Socrates and which are just Plato talking to himself in a Socratic costume. But even they admit, your fiction feels more honest than most men's facts. One morning, you write a line so strange, it gives you chills. No one is more hated than he who speaks the truth. You stare at it. You hear his voice again, calm and fearless. The courtroom. The silence. The poison. You wonder, am I writing philosophy, or am I writing a eulogy in installments? And yet, the work deepens. You move from ethics to metaphysics. You start imagining not just better cities, but better realities. You describe a world beyond this one. A realm of forms, perfect, eternal blueprints. Somewhere, you say, there exists the perfect circle. The perfect justice. The perfect good. And what we see here. Mere shadows. Copies. Pale and flickering. To understand this world, you say, we must learn to remember that one. Here's a lovely oddity. Some ancient sources suggest that before settling fully into philosophy, you seriously considered becoming a playwright, and that your early works were actual tragedies performed in Athens. None survive. But you smile sometimes, imagining an alternate life where you wrote weepy dramas instead of metaphysical architecture. But your real tragedy? You keep writing Socrates alive, knowing full well you'll never hear his voice again. You sculpt his image so often, you start to wonder if you've erased the men behind the method. And you see the irony. Socrates rejected writing. He believed knowledge should be spoken, lived, breathed. But you, his most devoted student, are building your legacy entirely in ink and parchment. You defend yourself, even in your own dialogues. In Phaedrus, you have Socrates debate the limitations of writing, only to subtly admit that writing has its place, when done right. When it points not to itself, but to what lives behind it. And so, your dialogues become maps to ideas. Not destinations, but signposts. You're no longer writing to win arguments. You're writing to make others think. And in doing so, you shift philosophy from an elite pastime to a human art. Because someday, long after your body has turned to dust, someone might read your words and hear something strange echoing back. Not you. Not Socrates. But themselves. You start drawing on the walls of the mind now, not with chalk, but with metaphor. And your most famous metaphor? A cave. Imagine, you say, that people have lived their entire lives chained inside a dark cave. All they can see are shadows cast on the wall by firelight behind them, shadows of objects carried by others. That's all they know. That's their reality. Then, imagine one prisoner escapes. He turns around, blinks, sees the fire, stumbles out of the cave, and outside, sunlight, trees, real people, color, truth. And when he returns to the cave to tell the others what he's seen, they laugh at him. They kill him. You call this the allegory of the cave, and it becomes your most haunting idea. People live in illusion. Most prefer shadows. And those who escape, they're seen as madmen. Sound familiar? Historians still debate whether this allegory was written as a veiled autobiography of Socrates, or of you. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But the metaphor lands like a thunderclap. Suddenly, philosophy isn't just an old man asking annoying questions, it's a jailbreak. A light. A way out. You go deeper. You begin describing the form of the good, the ultimate source of all truth, all meaning. You say it's like the sun, not just something we see by, but the thing that makes seeing possible. You struggle to define it fully, because how do you explain the light using only the shadows? One evening, while lecturing on this, you fall into a silence. You stare upward, toward the ceiling, as if words just fall short. Your students wait. You say nothing. Sometimes, silence teaches better than speech. Here's your quirky note for tonight. Some ancient writers claim that you were so reluctant to explain the form of the good in writing, you only ever taught it orally to your most advanced students, like a secret initiation. They even say Aristotle didn't get it. Or wasn't ready. Or, maybe, wasn't meant to. You never say the form of the good is God, but you flirt with the idea. Whatever it is, you hint that it's not just logic. It's beauty. Order. Love. Maybe even home. Meanwhile, back in Athens, the same old games continue. Elections. Theaters. Lawsuits. The world remains messy, hungry, loud. But you walk among it like a ghost who's seen daylight. Your dialogues become more abstract, more symbolic. Socrates becomes less of a man and more of a mouthpiece, like a puppet carved from grief and hope. You try to prepare your students. Not for debate, but for awakening. You want them to recognize the shadows. To turn toward the fire. To climb out. Even if the sunlight blinds them. And yes, sometimes you wonder if it's all just a beautiful delusion. If the form of the good is just your own longing, crystallized. If the cave isn't out there, but inside you. But you keep teaching anyway. Because even if truth remains just out of reach, the search. That's what makes you free. You start asking different kinds of questions now. Not just what is justice or what is truth, but what is love? Where do souls go when they die? Why does beauty move us so deeply we forget to breathe? You're not softening. You're expanding. The hard geometry of your earlier work now curves gently into mystery, into myth, into the raw, beating heart of the human condition. You write the symposium, a banquet of minds, each offering their vision of love. One speaks of lust, another of partnership. One praises the divine madness love inspires. And then Socrates speaks, not in his own words, but in those of a mysterious woman, Diotima. She tells of love as a ladder. At the bottom, physical desire. At the top, the love of pure form. The good, the eternal, the divine spark behind all longing. Historians still debate whether Diotima was real or symbolic. Some say she was a priestess. Others think she was a literary mask, a voice you needed to carry an idea too sacred for Socrates. But whoever she was, her vision reshapes how the world will think about love for centuries. You also write the Phaedo, a dialogue that takes place during Socrates' final hours. There, your teacher speaks not of death as loss, but as liberation. He argues that the soul is immortal, that it existed before birth, and will continue after the body fades. You say the soul forgets its knowledge at birth, then slowly remembers through philosophy. Life is not learning, it is recollection. And reincarnation. Yes, you go there too. The soul is judged, rewarded, punished, recycled. One soul might return as a philosopher, another as a donkey. Depends on how they lived. Here's your fringe detail for tonight. In the myth of air, a soldier dies in battle, then returns to life 9 days later with tales of the afterlife. He describes judges, cosmic machinery, soul lotteries. It's part Homer, part hallucination, part theology, and you place it at the end of the Republic like a riddle in a bottle. Some call it a parable. Others, a warning. You never explain. You're weaving myth and math now. Dialectic and dream. You call it soul gymnastics, the exercise of purifying thought so the soul can ascend. And if it sounds religious, that's because it is, in its own way. You don't found a church, but you give philosophy a spirit. You make it sacred. You begin to say things like, the body is a prison. You begin to believe that wisdom isn't just clarity, it's purification. You begin to see the soul as a thing that must be trained like a wild horse. You look at your students differently now. Not just as minds, but as travelers. As sparks. And you wonder, how many of them will make it out of the cave? Not many, you think. But maybe enough. Because in the end, love isn't just desire. It's memory. The soul remembering its true home. And philosophy. It's the ladder. You just hope they're still climbing. You start asking different kinds of questions now. Not just, what is justice, or what is truth? But, what is love? Where do souls go when they die? Why does beauty move us so deeply we forget to breathe? You're not softening. You're expanding. The hard geometry of your earlier work now curves gently into mystery, into myth, into the raw, beating heart of the human condition. You write the symposium, a banquet of minds, each offering their vision of love. One speaks of lust, another of partnership. One praises the divine madness love inspires. And then Socrates speaks, not in his own words, but in those of a mysterious woman, Diotima. She tells of love as a ladder. At the bottom, physical desire. At the top, the love of pure form. the good, the eternal, the divine spark behind all longing. Historians still debate whether Diotima was real or symbolic. Some say she was a priestess. Others think she was a literary mask, a voice you needed to carry an idea too sacred for Socrates. But whoever she was, her vision reshapes how the world will think about love for centuries. You also write the Phaedo, a dialogue that takes place during Socrates' final hours. There, your teacher speaks not of death as loss, but as liberation. He argues that the soul is immortal, that it existed before birth, and will continue after the body fades. You say the soul forgets its knowledge at birth, then slowly remembers through philosophy. Life is not learning, it is recollection. And reincarnation. Yes, you go there too. The soul is judged, rewarded, punished, recycled. One soul might return as a philosopher, another as a donkey. Depends on how they lived. Here's your fringe detail for tonight. In the myth of air, a soldier dies in battle, then returns to life 9 days later with tales of the afterlife. He describes judges, cosmic machinery, soul lotteries. It's part Homer, part hallucination, part theology, and you place it at the end of the Republic like a riddle in a bottle. Some call it a parable. Others, a warning. You never explain. You're weaving myth and math now. Dialectic and dream. You call it soul gymnastics, the exercise of purifying thought so the soul can ascend. And if it sounds religious, that's because it is, in its own way. You don't found a church, but you give philosophy a spirit. You make it sacred. You begin to say things like, the body is a prison. You begin to believe that wisdom isn't just clarity, it's purification. You begin to see the soul as a thing that must be trained like a wild horse. You look at your students differently now. Not just as minds, but as travelers. As sparks. And you wonder, how many of them will make it out of the cave? Not many, you think. But maybe enough. Because in the end, love isn't just desire. It's memory. The soul remembering its true home. And philosophy. It's the ladder. You just hope they're still climbing. You start asking different kinds of questions now. Not just, what is justice, or what is truth? But, what is love? Where do souls go when they die? Why does beauty move us so deeply we forget to breathe? You're not softening. You're expanding. The hard geometry of your earlier work now curves gently into mystery. Into myth. Into the raw, beating heart of the human condition. You write the Symposium, a banquet of minds, each offering their vision of love. One speaks of lust. Another of partnership. One praises the divine madness love inspires. And then Socrates speaks, not in his own words, but in those of a mysterious woman, Diotima. She tells of love as a ladder. At the bottom, physical desire. At the top, the love of pure form. The good. The eternal. The divine spark behind all longing. Historians still debate whether Diotima was real or symbolic. Some say she was a priestess. Others think she was a literary mask, a voice you needed to carry an idea too sacred for Socrates. But whoever she was, her vision reshapes how the world will think about love for centuries. You also write the Phaedo, a dialogue that takes place during Socrates' final hours. There, your teacher speaks not of death as loss, but as liberation. He argues that the soul is immortal, that it existed before birth, and will continue after the body fades. You say the soul forgets its knowledge at birth, then slowly remembers through philosophy. Life is not learning, it is recollection. And reincarnation. Yes, you go there too. The soul is judged, rewarded, punished, recycled. One soul might return as a philosopher, another as a donkey. Depends on how they lived. Here's your fringe detail for tonight. In the myth of air, a soldier dies in battle, then returns to life 9 days later with tales of the afterlife. He describes judges, cosmic machinery, soul lotteries. It's part Homer, part hallucination, part theology, and you place it at the end of the Republic like a riddle in a bottle. Some call it a parable. Others, a warning. You never explain. You're weaving myth and math now. Dialectic and dream. You call it soul gymnastics, the exercise of purifying thought so the soul can ascend. And if it sounds religious, that's because it is, in its own way. You don't found a church, but you give philosophy a spirit. You make it sacred. You begin to say things like, the body is a prison. You begin to believe that wisdom isn't just clarity, it's purification. You begin to see the soul as a thing that must be trained like a wild horse. You look at your students differently now. Not just as minds, but as travelers. As sparks. And you wonder, how many of them will make it out of the cave? Not many, you think. But maybe enough. Because in the end, love isn't just desire. It's memory. The soul remembering its true home. And philosophy. It's the latter. You just hope they're still climbing. Your final days are quiet. No mobs. No trials. No poison. Just parchment, olive trees, and the steady rustle of thoughts settling in the corners of your mind like dust. You still teach, but less often. The younger students crowd around Aristotle now, eager for lists and classifications, for cause and effect. You listen with a half-smile, amused by their hunger for precision, for categories you once found comfort in too. You know now, the soul doesn't move in straight lines. Your body begins to betray you. The joints stiffen. Your voice, once firm with dialectic thunder, grows thinner, softer. You spend longer hours in the sun, watching its arc, its reminder that time is both a circle and a vanishing line. And one morning, you don't rise. They find you still, eyes closed, a half-finished scroll resting on your chest. A dialogue with no closing lines. A sentence mid-thought. Typical. Historians argue over where you died. Some say in Athens. Others in a nearby town, after a fall. The details blur, as they always do when a life becomes a symbol. What's certain? You left behind everything. Over 30 dialogues. A school that would last 9 centuries. And an idea that maybe thinking well is the closest we ever come to living well. Here's your final fringe fact. Despite being one of the most influential figures in human thought, we have no physical descriptions of you that weren't filtered through centuries of reverence. No reliable statues. No portraits. Just words. You became your words. And your words, they became a mirror. Students would carry them across continents. Mystics would find hidden codes in your metaphors. Emperors would quote your cave. Popes, revolutionaries, scientists, even atheists, each would claim a piece of you. You made Socrates immortal. And, in doing so, became myth yourself. But if we could ask you just one more question, what would you say? Maybe nothing. Maybe just a question in return. Maybe, have you left the cave yet? Because that was always the point. Not to answer, but to awaken.